So glad to be together with you tonight to worship our God. Appreciate the wonderful singing that we've enjoyed. A great chapter from the book of Hosea. And now we're going to talk about raccoons for a while, so it's going to be a good night. We're happy to be able to worship our God tonight, and I hope as I begin this lesson with an illustration that you'll pay some attention to this illustration and understand how it's going to connect to a very important topic that we'll get to in just a minute. You're looking at a stamp that was issued by the island of Guadeloupe, which is in the Caribbean Sea, which is a French territory. So it's the words on it are in French, but it's obviously got a big raccoon on it because in Guadeloupe, the raccoon is the thing. It's the national animal, if you will, and I'll explain why momentarily. In 1911, a dead raccoon was sent in a box from Guadeloupe to the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History for it to be examined and cataloged. And the particular guy that opened up the box and began to look at the raccoon was a fellow by the name of Garrett Miller. And he was a biologist who was trained in recognizing species and, in fact, identifying species. And he did not recognize the particular kind of raccoon that he was looking at. It was different from anything that he'd ever seen. And so he, as they do at Natural Museums of History, had the authority and gave it a new species name. He thought he was looking at a new species. And so he called it the Guadeloupe raccoon, basically, to put it short. That's not the technical species name. But it's a special raccoon now that's only found there on a couple of islands in Guadeloupe. He christened it, the species name is Procyon minor, if anybody wants to get particular about that. In doing so, Mr. Miller changed the history of Guadeloupe, because when they realized after some time, and the word got back to them down in Guadeloupe, that they had their own raccoon, people went crazy for the raccoon. It turns out that that's the biggest animal on the island. There's not a bigger mammal other than man that inhabits the island, so it's the thing. And they have now a national park that's to the raccoon, and it's the featured animal in their zoo. People go to the zoo to look at raccoons, and they're protected. The French nation passed a law on behalf of Guadeloupe in 1979 that made it illegal to kill a raccoon or to harm a raccoon or have one as a pet. So they just roam all over the island, going crazy. They're eating the watermelons and decimating the crops and all that sort of thing. But the people there love them. It's their national symbol. And you can understand maybe why. Well, if you fast forward a while, you come to 1999, and then again in 2003, some biologists decided to do some studying of this Guadeloupe raccoon, and they studied its morphology, and then DNA testing was coming along, and they studied its DNA, and they found out that, in fact, it's exactly the same raccoon that we have in North America. There's not a dime's worth of difference between the two raccoons. What had happened was the raccoon that had been sent to the biologist at the Smithsonian back in 1911 was a juvenile raccoon. It wasn't full grown. So he assumed he was looking at a new species and it was just a baby or whatever. So what happened was, when this was discovered in the early 2000s, then news of it began to get out. But the government in Guadeloupe didn't really tell the people this. So the people are still going on down there in ignorance for some good time, assuming that they have this special raccoon that symbolizes their country. Eventually, of course, word started to get around a little bit, and some people found out. And you can just picture the discussions that were going on at the coffee shops and things. A guy comes in, he said, I just read this report on the internet and some scientific journal or whatever that our raccoon's not special. It's just it's like everybody else's raccoon. And the guy that would say that said, "Shut up, get out of town. We don't believe you. Don't talk down on our raccoon." All that kind of stuff. What are you doing dissing our raccoon? I don't know how they'd say it in Guadeloupe, but they're all about protecting the reputation of their raccoon. Well, eventually the word did sort of get out, And it was shocking to many of the people that live there and come to love their raccoon. One woman, when she was told about this, said, you know what, maybe what really happened was, instead of the North American raccoon being brought to Guadeloupe a couple hundred years ago, which is what scientists think happened, maybe really what happened is it was the Guadeloupe raccoon that got taken to America. So really, they just all have our raccoon. She's trying to figure out how she can still have a special raccoon, but that's obviously not what happened. Another lady said, when she was told about it and read the scientific report about it, she says, okay, I know that it's an invasive species, it's not native to our island, but it's cute and I like it. It's cute and I like it. So that's the story of the Guadeloupe raccoon. This example, I want you to understand, is illustrating something that's important for us to see. People accept a notion, an idea, without really thorough examination or without really having all the facts. And they accept it, and it becomes a tradition. And the tradition becomes ingrained in a culture. And the culture refuses to change no matter what facts are presented to it. No matter what the facts turn out to be, the culture will not change. And so when it comes to the Guadeloupe raccoon, is it a special species or a trick of tradition? Well, to people who refused to change their tradition, it's still a special species. And I find an amazing parallel between that and the way people treat instrumental music in worship. Is it an acceptable worship act, or is it a trick of tradition? What we're going to look at tonight is lots of evidence, some from history and some from the scriptures, that demonstrate that instrumental music in worship is not of divine origin. It did not come from God. It's not scripturally authorized. It came in as a tradition not all that long ago, actually about the same time as the raccoon came to Guadalupe. Music began to enter into a lot of religious denominations, instrumental music. And now it's such a tradition. You show people the facts and they say, it's cute and I like it. Don't take it away from me. I literally had a guy tell me that, not the cute and I like it part, but he said I was showing him verses on instrumental music one time and he said, oh, now don't take away my music, I like it. Literally what he said. Just the same attitude that this lady in Guadeloupe had. So what I want to start with tonight, you might have thought I already started. What I want to start with tonight is just an examination of the tradition of instrumental music in worship. And I want to establish with you the fact that instrumental music in worship was not widely accepted for centuries, for long, long centuries, by anybody who called themselves Christians. Might somebody have done it in, the second or third centuries? Well, maybe, but we don't have a lot of record of that if that's the case. Everything that we seem to have that commenting on it said early Christians did not do it, did not have anything to do with it, and objected to it strenuously on a number of bases. So I'll show you, for instance, a quote from Clement of Alexandria, who lived in the 2nd century into the 3rd century. He says, leave the pipe to the shepherd, the flute to the men who are in fear of gods, little g gods, and intent on their idol worshiping. Instrumental music was used in the worship of idols. Such musical instruments must be excluded from our wineless feast. There's also a note there about the fact that they weren't drinking wine in their feasts. Christians weren't. So that's what Clement said early on. Eusebius, who may be a name that's familiar to some of you, is a great historian of church history. He's quoted often. He's a careful historian of the church up into his time. And Eusebius lived in Caesarea on the coast of the Mediterranean, which of course has great biblical history surrounding it. But Eusebius lived in the 3rd century into the 4th, and he said, we render our hymn with a living psalterion and a living cithara, with spiritual songs. The unison of voices of Christians would be more acceptable to God than any musical instrument. Accordingly, in all the churches of God, united in soul and attitude, with one mind and in agreement of faith and piety, we send up a unison melody in the words of the Psalms. What Eusebius says is interesting on a couple of levels. One thing he says is, what we all do in all the churches is we're just singing with our voices. In essence, is what he's saying. And that's accepted in all the churches. And like, as I said, Eusebius would have known because he was a tremendous historian and very well acquainted with what would have been going on in especially all the churches in the Mediterranean basin. So he would have known that. The second thing that I think is interesting about his quote, and we'll get back to this at the end of the lesson, is that they're just singing the words of the Psalms, because there are people today that say if you have a psalm, you have to play it. But Eusebius didn't know that. He was just singing the words of the Psalms, as all the churches were, is the way he puts that. And then you go on in history just a little bit. John Chrysostom, who's a great commentator of the 4th century, said, David formerly sang songs also. Today we sing hymns. He had a lyre with lifeless strings. The church has a lyre with living strings. Our tongues are the strings of the lyre, with a different tone indeed, but much more in accordance with piety. So you see, he's plainly saying, David may have played a harp, but we don't do that. We sing with our tongues. Then Augustine, famous ancient theologian, respected highly by a lot of people in the denominational world, Catholics and Calvinists and others. I disagree with Augustine on a lot of things, but he wrote voluminously about a lot of different things. And Augustine said musical instruments were not used. The pipe, tabret, harp were associated so intimately with the sensual heathen cults, as well as with the wild revelries and shameless performances of the degenerate theater and circus, it's easy to understand the prejudices against their use in worship. So what Augustine's saying is, the idolaters use music in worship, and besides that, to paraphrase it and put it in modern language, all the rock and roll bands have music, have instrumental music. He doesn't call them rock and roll bands, but all the people that are playing in the theaters and the circuses and the wild parties, they're using instrumental music. So we understand the objection why we wouldn't want to bring that into worship. That's Augustine writing in the 4th century. And then Thomas Aquinas. I want to go forward to Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas is highly regarded in scholarly circles as probably the best scholar ever in the Catholic Church. Aquinas was a Catholic. If you study the history of instrumental music, you know that in about the 7th and 8th centuries, instrumental music began to be accepted in places in the Catholic Church. That's when it first really got some traction, and a number of churches began to use instrumental music. But even in the Catholic Church, not all Catholic churches used instrumental music. In fact, maybe in some parts of the world, not the majority of them might not have used instrumental music. And Aquinas' comment on this is very telling. He said, our church does not use musical instruments as harps and psalteries to praise God withal, that she may not seem to Judaize. In other words, here's what was done in the Old Testament, here's what the Jews did, but we're careful not to have instrumental music because we don't want to look like what the Jews did in the Old Testament, is in essence what Aquinas is saying. So what you have from the ancient history up to the late Middle Ages is not a widespread acceptance of instrumental music, even though the Catholics, I would admit, and everybody understands, did accept it. Not all of them even accepted it. Well, somebody says, well, what about, all of the bright thinkers and the great lights of the Protestant Reformation? What about Luther? What about Calvin? What about the Wesley brothers? What about all of these people that, are responsible for the Protestant Reformation as we know it? Well, what about them? Early Protestant denominations did not approve of instruments in worship. Almost to a man, the early reformers who were trying to straighten out the Catholic Church, starting with Martin Luther, did not agree with instrumental music in worship. Luther said, although Luther was a sort of an aficionado of instruments of music, he didn't want them in the worship. He appreciated instrumental music, but he didn't want them in the worship. He said the organ in worship is an ensign of Baal. In other words, it's idolatry. Don't bring the organ into worship. That's what Luther said. Calvin, of course, responsible for Calvinism, followed closely by Presbyterians and some Baptists and others. Calvin said musical instruments in celebrating the praises of God would be no more suitable than the burning of incense, the lighting of lamps, the restoration of other shadows of the law. In other words, he said instruments of music are that's Old Testament stuff. It would be no more appropriate to do that than it would be to burn incense or light lamps or whatever. He said the simplicity which God commands to us by the apostles is far more pleasing to him. Words of John Calvin. John Wesley, who is regarded by Methodists themselves as the founder of the Methodist Church, they will tell you that. Wesley said, "I have no objection to the organs in our chapels as long as they are neither seen or heard." So that's what he thought about it. What about others? Charles Spurgeon. If you ask anybody who knows anything about Baptist church history, and you ask them to name the 2 or 3 greatest Baptist church preachers of all time, Spurgeon is almost always at the top of the list. So Spurgeon, probably the most famous preacher anywhere in the 19th century, and certainly among Baptist preachers. Here's what Spurgeon said. He lived from 1834 to 1892. "The great congregation which is blessed with the privilege of listening to his instruction has no organ to assist them in singing their praises to their God and Savior. They find their vocal organs sufficient. Their tongues and voices express the gratitude of their hearts. I would just as soon pray to God with machinery as to sing to God with machinery." That's what Spurgeon said. And again, Spurgeon's regarded as most famous Baptist preacher of his day. His sermons, you can go find his sermons still on the internet. They've posted all over the internet, and people refer to them. Adam Clarke, who is a well-known Methodist commentator, I have his commentary in my library, as some of you probably do. He said, "I'm an old man, an old minister. I here declare that I never knew them," talking about instrumental music, "I never knew them productive of any good in the worship of God. I've had a reason to believe that they were productive of much evil. Music as a science I esteem and admire, but instruments of music in the house of God I abominate and abhor. This is the abuse of music, and here I register my protest against all such corruptions in the worship of the author of Christianity." Adam Clarke. Presbyterian Board of Publications of Philadelphia, 1842. "The question is there any authority for instrumental music in the worship of God under the present dispensation? The answer is, not the least. Only the singing of psalms and hymns and spiritual songs was appointed by the apostles. Not a syllable is said in the New Testament in favor of instrumental music, nor was it ever introduced into the church until after the 8th century. Presbyterians writing that in 1842. Well, that's an awful lot of folks that didn't think and don't think that we ought to have instruments of music in worship. So how did we get it? How did it come into worship? And how did it come to be an accepted tradition today? How was it justified and how was it rationalized? And how is it justified and rationalized today? Well, the biggest way that it's rationalized today, quite frankly, is, if you get down to the bottom line of what people are saying in the denominations, is we've always done it. Well, we've already seen all kinds of evidence that they haven't always done it, but they think they have. They've got a Guadalupe raccoon. Okay, they think it's always been there, and it's always been their special thing, but it's not. That's not the case, as we've already seen. Plainly not the case. But they'll go back and they'll say, well, David did it. How many times have you had a discussion with somebody, and if you actually start to talk about the scriptures that might justify instrumental music in the worship service, they'll say, well, David played harp or whatever. And a lot of the denominational people we just quoted from recognized, didn't they, in those quotes, that yeah, David played instrumental music. It was back in the Old Testament. They recognized that, but they also knew you don't bring Old Testament stuff into the New Testament unless the New Testament says to do it. Unfortunately, a lot of people run around today that either don't understand that or don't want to understand it because they love their tradition. It's cute and they like it, the instrumental music. People understand, these same people that make this argument, that the sacrifices of the Old Testament have been done away with. There's not any of them that say we need to be killing lambs we need to be burning incense. Well, you might say burning incense, but we don't need to be killing lambs and all of that, keeping of the Old Testament laws by and large. They understand all of that's been done away with. But they say, well, instrumental music is different. It's not like those ritual laws of the Old Testament. It's not like the sacrificial system of the Old Testament. Is it not? Look at 2 Chronicles chapter 29 as we go to the scriptures now. And notice in 2 Chronicles chapter 29, in the days of Hezekiah, they're trying to reinstate the Old Testament worship as God had ordained it in the temple. And it says in verse 29, chapter 29, verse 25, that he stationed the Levites in the house of God, in the house of the Lord, with cymbals, with stringed instruments, with harps, according to the commandment of David, of Gad the king's seer, and of Nathan the prophet, for thus was the commandment of the Lord by his prophets. So the Lord commanded instrumental music in the Old Testament. You don't have a verse like that in the New Testament. You don't have a verse that's a 30-second cousin to that in the New Testament. There's no place in the New Testament that says God's commanded Christians to do this. In the Old Testament, there's a verse that's really plain that they were supposed to do it. The next couple of verses, if you get down to verse 27, Hezekiah commanded them to offer the burnt offerings on the altar. When the burnt offering began, the song of the Lord also began, with the trumpets and the instruments of David, the king of Israel. So all the assembly worshiped, the singers sang, the trumpeters sounded. All this continued until the burnt offering was finished. Don't tell me that instrumental music and sacrifices don't have anything to do with each other. They're right together. You see that in that text? The sacrifices were going on while the instruments were being played, and when the sacrifices stopped, the instruments stopped. People running around saying, well, instrumental music and sacrifices, that doesn't have anything to do with each other. Well, they're right there together under the old law. Yeah, it has something to do with each other. The old law was an unbearable yoke of bondage. It's said over and over and over again in the New Testament. The Jews didn't keep it, they wouldn't keep it, and to hear them tell it, they couldn't keep it. In Acts chapter 15 and verse 10, Peter says, in talking to Jews who are trying to get people to follow the old law and be circumcised, he said, why do you test God by putting a yoke on the neck of the disciples which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear? We could not bear the yoke of the Old Testament law. In Galatians, Paul, after showing that the curse of the law was upon all who are under it, all who had anything to do with it, he says, as many as are of the works of the law are under a curse, for it is written, cursed is everyone who does not continue in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them. Which is to say, if you're going to keep the old law, if you're going to go back to the old law and say David did instruments, you better go back to the old law and do every last single solitary thing, other thing that's in the old law. And if you don't, Paul says you're cursed. So there's none of this business. I don't know where people get it. Well, we can take parts of the old law if we want to, instrumental music or tithing or this and that, but we don't have to keep the rest of it. That's exactly the opposite of what Paul says in that verse. You want to keep some of it, you better keep all of it. For whoever, James says in James chapter 2 and verse 10 and 11, whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point is guilty of all. He who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. If you commit adultery, but you do murder, you've become a transgressor of the law. And we could go on and on about that. So people say, well, David did it, but that didn't have anything to do with whether we're supposed to do it today. I hope you see that. David lived under a different law. His commands were given to him by a God who was directing people under the law of Moses, which we are not under any longer. The second reason that we still have instruments today and that people use to justify instrumental music are some rather uninformed appeals to the meanings of Solow and Psalmos. Now, most of us probably realize, some may not, but I'll just tell you that the Greek word Solow is the verb for singing, to sing. And it's found a few times in our New Testament. The Greek word for a psalm is psalmos. So we're talking about the Greek words for singing and for a song that we find in our New Testaments. And so a couple of arguments are made here that I want to sort of burst the balloon of those who make them, if I can, just real quickly. Some argue that from 1 Corinthians 14:26, that you've got a psalm there that's mentioned in the worship. And since Old Testament psalms were played with instrumental music, which they were, therefore, if you're going to do a psalm in the worship, you can have the instrumental music in the worship. That's the reasoning. That's the line of logic. Well, there's a problem with that line of logic. Actually, there are a couple of them. First of all, the major premise is not necessarily true. It's assumed that when 1 Corinthians 14:26 says, "How is it then, brethren, when you come together, each of you has a psalm?" It's assumed that those psalms are Old Testament psalms. But in the context, actually that's highly unlikely. In the context of 1 Corinthians 14, Paul is regulating the use of spiritual gifts in the assembly of the church, which they had in the first century. Miraculous spiritual gifts and revelations and tongue speaking. And so he says, actually in this verse, 1 Corinthians 14:26, whenever you come together, each of you has a psalm, has a teaching, has a tongue, has a revelation, has an interpretation. Let all things be done to edification. It's highly likely in this context that a psalm would have been not something from the Old Testament, but something that God had given somebody by inspiration to share with the church in the New Testament. So the assumption that it's an Old Testament psalm that's being talked about is just that. It's an assumption. The other thing about it is assumed, not proven, that while, yes, psalms could be accompanied by instrumental music in the Old Testament, that they always were accompanied by instrumental music, or that they had to be accompanied by instrumental music. And that's just an assumption that people just draw, frankly, out of thin air. There's absolutely no warrant for it, either in the Word or in the history of the Word, usage of the idea of a psalm. The second thing that people do with these words to try to justify instrumental music is they want to define them in ways that are frankly just wrong. They want to misdefine them, maybe I should say. Let me tell you something about the word Solow, which is, again, the verb to sing. It's found about 5 times in the New Testament. E.A. Sophocles, who taught Greek at Harvard University in the last half of the 19th century, said about the word Solow as it occurs in the New Testament, and I quote, "It means to chant or sing religious hymns." That's the meaning of the word. He says nothing about it meaning anything about playing an instrument whatsoever. Joseph Henry Thayer's Greek lexicon traces changes in the word Solow from the beginning of its usage in the Greek language all the way through the Roman period. I probably need to explain this a little bit, and so put your thinking caps on for just a minute with me. This is one of those lectures that you get that normally people kind of fade out when you start to talk about this kind of stuff. The word Solow is an ancient Greek word. It began to be used by Homer about 900 BC. Homer uses it to refer to playing an instrument. In fact, the original meaning was to pluck or to twang, was really the meaning of the word Solow. And you find it being used like that in classical Greek. But classical Greek is only used, the development of language over a period of time from about 900 BC to about 400 BC. So it covers the time of not only Homer, but also Aristotle and Plato and playwrights like Aeschylus. They would write in classical Greek. But the Greek language, like all living languages do, sort of changed over time. The English that we speak is very, very much different from the English that King James spoke or that Shakespeare spoke. And that's just 500 years since then. So language changes a lot over time, and it's changed a lot in my lifetime. When I was a boy, gay meant happy. That's all it meant. It never meant anything else but happy. And now it means anything but happy, I guess. It refers to somebody's sexual orientation. And now you got a word, I remember when bad meant bad. But when I was a teenager, bad became good. I don't know what happened there, but all of a sudden bad, somebody's riding a nice vehicle or something, and you say, wow, that's a bad vehicle. That means good. So all kinds of words change. In fact, they can turn completely opposite in their meanings. So this word, which originally did mean to play, came to mean sing. And let me quote you some about that. Joseph Henry Thayer, in talking about the word, gives that history to it in his lexicon of Greek words. But when he gets to the finish of all of giving that history, he writes this, and I quote, "In the New Testament, it means to sing a hymn, to celebrate praise to God in song." That's its meaning in the New Testament. And, of course, the New Testament is written not in classical Greek, but in Koine Greek, the common language of the day, which was, in fact, much different from the classical period. The same happens to be true of psalmos. Sophocles defines psalmos as a song or a chant. It's just the song or a chant. Thayer goes back and he gives, for instance, that Euripides used it to mean a striking or a twanging, which fits because Euripides lived 480 BC when classical Greek was being used. He mentions that it means striking the chords of a musical instrument. Pindar and Aeschylus used it that way. Well, Pindar lived from 525 to 443 BC, and Aeschylus lived from 525 to 456 BC, well before Koine Greek began to even be spoken. They were using classical Greek. What's happened is, I've actually seen this. People who think they know something about Greek or can look it up in a Greek lexicon, they read what Thayer says in his Greek lexicon. See, it's playing, it's plucking, it's twanging. Well, Thayer's quoting from Aeschylus and Pindar and these guys that lived 500 years before Jesus. That's not what it meant in Koine Greek, and Thayer's not saying that is what it meant in Koine Greek. He's just given the etymology or the word history of the word. You know, a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. If you want to use a lexicon, you need to learn how to read it. And a lot of these guys writing articles on the internet don't know how to read a lexicon. Thayer finishes his discussion of psalmos by saying simply this: it's a pious song or a psalm. That's his definition. Doesn't say anything about plucking or twanging or anything like that. Doesn't say it has to be played, with an instrument, as a lot of these guys are writing in their articles today. A lot of people, I read an article somebody shared with me about, the guy says, well, he went back to the Greek Old Testament, where the Old Testament translated from Hebrew into Greek about 200 years before Christ. And that's a period of transition when Koine was beginning to be used. And they note how Solow and Psalmos are used in the Old Testament translation. Well, sure, they're translating Hebrew, where those concepts are in the text. There's a lot of Hebraisms in the Greek of the Septuagint of the Old Testament. And somebody reads that and tries to fix that so that that's also what it means in the New Testament is, frankly, out of their minds. It won't work. It can't work. It's not logical. It's not sensible, and it's not fair. So, thank you for paying attention to that. I hope you stayed awake for that last 5 minutes and for all of it. What are we saying? What are the facts? New Testament Christians did not use instrumental music in worship. There is not a reliable scholar of any stripe who says they did. There's not one. There is no command, there's no example, there's no necessary inference in the New Testament that they did. There is no record of instruments being used, in fact, for centuries in the worship of God, of the Christians. Most denominations accepted instrumental music within the last 250 years based on faulty reasoning, either going back to the Old Testament or misdefining plain Bible words. And now they've used them for less than 250 years, and they think they can't get rid of them because they got a raccoon and it's cute and they like it. The New Testament could not possibly be clearer. Speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. At midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. Paul says, what is the conclusion? Here's my conclusion. I will pray with the Spirit, and I will pray with the understanding also. I will sing with the Spirit, and I will sing with the understanding also. God could not have been any plainer about what he wanted. And to say that, well, we should or we could or we have to have instrumental music in the church today, you just love the raccoon. That's all there is to it. You got a tradition, you like it, and you're not paying attention to what the Word of God says. Thank you for your attention tonight. Go out and share this with people. They need to hear it. God deserves to be praised in the way he wants to be praised. And he's told us how that is. God deserves to be served in the way he wants to be served. And I guess the question we could ask as we close tonight is, are you doing that? Serving God in the way that he wants to be served. And if you know you're not, and you need to make it right, you need to confess fault in your life and ask for prayers, we'd be happy to help you. We'd ask you to come while we stand and while we sing.